Well, it's 3:30 and Eastern time, and we're delighted to have everyone with us, and looking forward to this time with David Fitch as he presents this webinar titled "Seeding and Launching Congregations." The first year shapes the church for decades. And so today we're going to explore a little bit about the history of church planting, introduction to approaches of church planting, and then also what does that mean in terms of what are the implications of all that? What does that mean for us? Because we have people on this website or this webinar that are district executives, or they're part of new church development teams for their districts or their regions. So, and then we also have some people that are in pastoral ministry and those that are interested in church revitalization and church planting. So we have a good mix here with us today, and looking forward to this conversation and your leadership. For those of you that know, David Fitch is the B.R. Lindner Chair of Evangelical Theology at Northern Seminary in Chicago. He writes on issues of local church, on issues that the local church faces in mission, cultural engagement, leadership, and theology, plus a number of other things. The other great thing is he's a church planter. So this is a practice of his as well, and something that is dear to his heart. And we want to turn the time over to him. But just as before we do that, just want to let you know that following the webinar, I will post in the chat box the link for your CEU credit. And also, if you could, please reply with any questions, comments that you have that you would like to ask David. And we kind of have this set up as David will spend a little bit of time presenting some content. We'll open it up for questions, but you can provide the questions at any time, but we'll just take a break here and there for him to respond, and then we'll continue with more content and kind of break it up in that way, so we have a ongoing engagement. And we'll look forward to it. And David, welcome, and look forward to what you have to share with us. I am going to turn over and share with you. Oh, nope, I can't do that. Where did that go? Okay, why am I not do more? No. I am having a challenge here. I need to switch my hosting to you.
To me?
Yes.
Why?
If you had slides or anything that you wanted to prepare or present, okay, then we'll just go with conversation.
Yeah, we don't need that. Yeah.
All right, sounds good. All
right, everybody. So thank you, Stan, for inviting me and gathering us together on this subject. I've been thinking through church planting for many years. I think I'm on my 7th church plant. Possibly 8th, depending on what counts. You know how that works. And I think a lot of the things we learn in church planting, I was just in a restaurant this morning at about 6 a.m. with somebody who's in leadership at our church plant, and we were just discussing the ins and outs of how do we draw people out of their particular consumer mindset to see church differently. And so I just think church planting is a great laboratory to think through what it means to be church and how to engage communities, neighborhoods, towns, villages for the gospel of the kingdom. So anyways, what I'm about to present is something that I've talked about over the years. It's pretty simple. There's a lot of underlying theological currents going on here. Frankly, I know your church has some Anabaptist rootages, and I think this little take on the history of church planting fits very well with some of my Anabaptist inclinations. So maybe if we have opportunity, maybe we can get into some questions and dig deeper into some of the theological implications of what I'm going to say here about the history of church planting and what it means for those of us who are church planting and also revitalizing churches. But let me just start here with the history. I believe that there has been a rolling history of church planting since World War II in North America. So I'll call this first round of church planting franchise church. This happened from immediately after World War II all the way up to the 60s and the 70s. You probably know at the end of World War II, really millions of GIs were returning from the war. And we are seeing a building out of subdivisions and suburbs from the cities like we have never seen before. And we're seeing a lot of people move from the city into the suburbs, into new places. And by the way, mostly white people. And so recognizing this, there was a ready market. So in, Pleasantville, Illinois, that's a fictional name, a new subdivision was being built, and they had a grocery store, they had a barbershop, they had those are two very important things for me, actually not the barbershop, but they had a barbershop, they had a grocery store, they had a library, they had a school, and they needed a church. And so, the Methodists had 250 people moved to Pleasantville, and they needed First Church of Methodist Pleasantville. And so what they did was they sent out a MDiv graduate from the Methodist Seminary to put up a sign, who knew the hymn book, who knew the liturgy book, who knew how to preach a Methodist, who knew the theology of Methodist, because that's a unique theology. And they franchised, and there was a ready market. And if the guy was mostly it was a guy, this was back in the 50s and 60s, if the guy was any good, you had a First Church of Methodist spring up. I call that franchise churches. Each denomination would do this over and over again as new populations in the growth of these new subdivisions. Let's call that franchise. There's a particular way of thinking about church planting that is built into the franchise model. But somewhere now, go further, late 70s, 80s, 90s. What you had is, during the 60s, you had the sexual revolution. You had the boomers that were born in the 40s and 50s, early 50s, leaving the church, saying, oh my goodness, the church is not relevant to me. But then in the 70s, the boomers got married, had children, so that by the mid-late 70s, they are actually thinking about going to church again. They had grown up in church. They didn't want the stale old high church liturgy of the Lutheran church. They didn't want the stale old Bible church sermons of the Bible church. But they were getting married, they were having children, they were longing for something like they had in their lives for their children. And so the seeker church movement was born for what they called the de-churched people. And the question was, what would make you come back to church? I call this the update model. So we had to update church to make it appealing to the boomers who had gone away from church and now got married and came back. Okay, so we got the franchise model, then we got the update model. Now we arrive in the 2000s, and we're now in a period of outright stagnation, maybe an outright decline of Christianized populations in North America. The markets for de-churched boomers is practically is exhausted, and more churches are being planted to try and tap into that de-churched market. Let's make church more hip. Let's make it more cool. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry about this. Forgot to turn my phone off. And now we have to realize that we actually have to engage people outside the Christian faith altogether. If Alan Hirsch is to be believed, and I don't know if he's always to be believed, but if he is to be believed, he says that 40% of the people in the United States still go to church on Sunday. 60% are now in that secularized realm. In Canada, these figures are as high as 10% church, 90% secularized. I was just in Europe, Germany, 1.5%, 2% go to church in Germany. And what Alan Hirsch says is, 90% of church planting goes for the 40% that are already interested in church. Very little work is being done to reach those outside the Christian faith. And so the question becomes, how am I going to plant a church now? If I do want to, if, like I believe, church is the political presence of the kingdom of God being implanted to give witness to the transforming power of the gospel of Jesus Christ, transform the world and people's lives. And I want to reach people outside the gospel. How is that possible? So we have a whole different kind of church. I would call this the missional or the incarnational church plant. So 3 waves of church planting. And what I always say is, the purpose of each church plant and what we're here to do and accomplish and who we're aiming our church plant at. By that I mean, for lack of a better word, target audience, or I hate to use marketing terms for various reasons. Forgive me, Josh Brockway. I know I'm going to get criticism for using that term, market or target. But what I say is, where you start and how you're thinking about church planting on any one of, if it's franchise, if it's update, if it's mission, will really shift how you think about doing all the things, from starting a church to leadership in church to what and how we think about gathering on a Sunday morning, to how we think about evangelism, et cetera, et cetera. So let me try to tease out some of those differences. So, first of all, the goals and purposes of these 3 types of church plants are quite different. For the franchise church, we have already people in Pleasantville, Illinois, that want a particular kind of church, Methodist church, Brethren church. They're already there. Denominationalism drives this idea of church plant. Today, by the way, we have a different kind of franchise. I'll call it the video venue. We have a church, let's say, in Naperville, and we have 250 people driving all the way from Westmont to Naperville to come to our venue. Well, why don't we just set up a venue in Westmont so those 250 people don't have to drive so far, pipe in the preaching via a screen. But the driving purpose of the franchise church is we have a market of Christians already there who want this thing, this franchise, kind of like McDonald's. We already know people want McDonald's. Before we build a McDonald's restaurant, pay all that money for the franchise, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, now the update church is a little bit different. The church has become somewhat irrelevant, disconnected from people in their lives who grew up once in church. And the driving purpose here is to make church relevant to de-churched, dormant Christians who once went to church a long time ago. And we want to reclaim those de-churched people. I ask you, is there anything wrong with that? I think we got to be careful about over-criticizing the mega churches, but there are weaknesses here in the consumer critique of how we try to make church more relevant or easy or convenient or fitting into your particular lifestyle has inherent dangers to it. But on the other hand, I've been to a lot of Baptist churches. I can throw the Baptist under the bus because I'm with the brethren today. I've been to a lot of Baptist churches where they haven't changed anything in like 62 years. And there's a lot of people who are 82 who are into it, but they're not. It's so off-putting. It's so, the language, it's like trying to go to a German Baptist church in the United States and they haven't translated anything in German. They don't realize no one else speaks German in the neighborhood. So anyways, all that to say, I'm not trying to throw the update church model of the reason behind why we do it and try to throw it under the bus and say this is all bad. There is a legitimate purpose in the update church. The mission church, however, the mission incarnational church plan sees the problem that the church has become ingrown. The church has become an island unto itself. We need to engage and extend and reach into places, the violent, hurting, lost places of the world, and reach people for the gospel, for the life of the life-giving redemption power of the Lordship of Jesus Christ, to people who have never darkened the door of a church, who frankly had no intention of darkening the door of a church, frankly despise sometimes the church. Incarnational mission church plant. So there you have it. There you have the driving purposes behind the franchise, behind the update, and behind what I'll call the incarnational mission church plan. But notice the differing premises. And, you know, at the very least, can we look at our contexts and ask, does this make any sense to plant an update church in a place that doesn't have a single, okay, I'm exaggerating, doesn't have 10 remaining people who at one time were Christians and now they are longing for a church? Does it make sense to do that? I was in Berlin about 3 months ago talking to some church planters. 1.5% of the people in Berlin are Christians who still consider going to a church. And a success, and I'm not kidding. A successful church plant was capturing like 400 of the 10,000 remaining Christians in Berlin and getting them interested in coming back to church. Is that what we should be doing in Berlin, Germany? Is that why we want to plant church? Let's take care of those 10,000 people. I mean, by the way, now we're getting into theology and so forth. We do have to gather a community to give witness to the gospel before the world. But, you know, sometimes I've been in these missionary contexts and it seems like we're spending 25 years figuring out how we can get 40 of the last 400 remaining Christians in Limoges, France to come to church on Sunday. That to me, no thank you, Stan. I am just so not interested.
It seems
I'm
like
going to beat my brains out to get the to get 10% of the remaining 400 Christians to come to church again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I mean, maybe we can pause to take some questions, but what I want to suggest to you is from going from franchise to update to mission incarnational changes the way you think about context, how you start a church, how you think about the horizon, how long this is going to take, how you measure how a church is going, what you do with worship, even preaching, how you do leadership. But before I get into that, is there any question?
I think people are still thinking and pondering. I do have a question. When the different models, and as you were saying, why would we do this in Berlin? To try to connect with 10,000 people. What is it that when we think about church planting, that our church, if you want to call it communities, denominational bodies, why is it that they fall back to those default models?
Well, first of all, I just want to tell you, it's mind-blowing that this indeed is what's happening over and over again, going back to default model franchise or default model update. And so my one impression is that it has worked in the past. Mm-hmm. And, if I give a speech like this someplace, I'll get a few emails from church planters who will then tell me in the email, have you seen what happened in such and such a place? Usually it's somewhere south of the Mason-Dixon line. And how many people they have in 3 years, and the music. And the amount of ego gratification or otherwise sense of I'm doing something big and important here is so overwhelming. And the question is, why can't I do this here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, mm-hmm. Yeah. Or Chicago? If you've got $1 million to spend and with the greatest equipment and you've got a media campaign, you can rustle up 400 Christians in Chicago pretty fast to start a sis boom ba church plant. But that's an awful lot of money. What? As I said, making church relevant is not necessarily all a bad thing, but it can turn into celebrity worship really quick. So I just think the reason why denominations have in the past defaulted to update models is because it's worked so well and it's been so dominant on the Christian horizon. But now, I would say in the last 3 years, I've talked to at least a half a dozen denominational leaders who have said, in no uncertain terms, I have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars planting church after church, and 5 years later, we have almost nothing to show for it. I'm sick of throwing $500,000 at a church plant. What else can we do? So I do sense a little bit of that going on as well.
So with this as well, what does this mean for us in the way? So here's a question that has come up. How would a person get started? Like, what would be the first step once you feel it is a direction you would go? So let's say you're weighing these models, or you're looking at the context. So what's that first step that a person or church planter is thinking about? This is what I got to do.
Yeah. Okay, Stan, just remind me, we've got till 3:30 Central Time, right?
3:30 Central Time, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, all right. So this is a good place for me to go with the first thing you do. What's the first thing you do in a franchise church versus an update church versus a mission incarnational church? Well, for a franchise church, what you did is you got all the goods and services set up according to the model of the Methodists or the Baptists. You know, I'm talking children's ministry, music minister, clergy leader, baptisms, weddings, all the goods and services as, you know, produced by your denomination, as led by a professional clergy person. Franchise church. That's the first thing you do. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, Stan, but when I was planning churches, okay, you got to have the children's ministry set up. You got to have a good preaching service. You've got to have a few people in the congregation to make it look like you have some people. You got to have a youth group leader and a Sunday school class. You know, so that's the first thing you do. And you got to have a hymnal. Our hymnal in my denomination was really not that good, but you still had to have it if you're going to start a Christian Missionary Alliance church. Anyways, in the update model, you do all these same things, but you just update them. The music is better. It's cooler. It's hipper. It's fantastic, actually. Sounds like U2. There, I just dated myself. You know, the preaching is, it's amazing. I mean, you have a celebrity guy who could just get up, mostly a guy. By the way, sorry to say that, but that's the way the previous models, that's the way they rolled. There's reasons for that, which I can go into in leadership, but you do all these things, but you just update them. With a mission incarnational church, the first thing you do is go and you move into a context. You inhabit that place. You live there. You get to know the town, the village that you live, and you start to exegete, sort out what's going on in this culture so as to be able to make sense of what the gospel is in this place. Now, I know you think that sounds, all you people out there in TV land think that sounds pie in the sky. I don't think so. So what we do is, and we're setting up a laboratory for this in about a couple of months, we find 3 leader couples to go move into a place, get a job to support themselves. So within 2 years, our hope is 3 years, that these people will be sustainable and committed to this place, sustainable financially and otherwise. 3 leaders, not 1. And they get to know the place, relationally engage the place, and slowly draw a group together. And I'll talk about how that takes shape and so forth. But we don't plant a Sunday morning gathering for a public gathering for possibly 2 to 3 years. And our goal at the end of 3 years is not to have a sustainable church with 200 people that all tithe, and so the money's coming in and we have a self-sustaining church. Our goal is to have self-sustaining missionaries working together in a place who, by the nature of their jobs and their finances, they're stable, they're there, and now they're capable of engaging for the long term. Does that help, Stan?
Yeah, so going back to that model versus some of the others that you have shared, what's the theology that drives it? What's the understanding of, in a sense, how does Scripture, how does the theology of one model versus the other, what's the difference, and why is that theology important to a model such as what you just shared?
It's a broad question, right? I mean, there's a lot of theology in what I just said. There's, for instance, the theology that informs the way leadership works. And I believe the Bible teaches mutuality. By the way, this is very Anabaptist. Mutuality, the gifts working together in concert, and people inhabiting a place, and church becomes a way of life, not a set of programs. And I've written about that in this book right here.
Faithful
But
presence. Good.
yeah, also other places. There is a theology of the way God works in a place that says we are called to inhabit that place, to listen to that place. Not just place, people. But remember, people are involved in social cultural mechanisms. I mean, antagonisms and strife and brokenness and oppression. And it's into these places we have to go, and we have to listen long enough to be able to proclaim that Jesus is Lord. He's working to reconcile the world to himself. He wants to forgive. He wants you to forgive. He wants to transform. He wants to make possible a new way of being together. So it's a big question, and I don't know if that helps, but I gave you a few little nuggets there of how I think theology is so important in understanding why we even want to do church. Because we cannot be Christians without a way of life and a witness to the gospel in the way we live among a people. That's why we go in threes, not one.
So we have again, like a model, or ways of looking at church planting and how it shapes the future of the church. So in a franchise or the update church, it's like, okay, we kind of know how that model works. A lot, it's kind of a corporate model in many ways. It's easy for us to pick up. It's ingrained within our culture and society. So
Yes.
how do these different models then reshape or change the way that we look at worship, mission, fellowship, community? Help us explore that as well.
Yeah, okay, let me just go through a few things. So, for instance, how do we view our context? In the franchise model, context is basically irrelevant. It just assumes a monolithic view of culture. So I'm going to plant the same Methodist church in Pleasantville, Illinois, as in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It doesn't matter. We're all Methodists. We all got the same hymn book. In the update church, we are surveying the context to see, or we are assuming church is wanted in this place. And now we just want to know how to present a set of goods and services that's relevant to the people in the context. I call that survey. We're surveying. But in mission, we are exegeting the context. We're exegeting, trying to know and listen where the issues of economics, power, pain, hurt, maybe even, I'm using a lot of P's here because it's the way I teach context at Northern Seminary. Party, where are they partying and what are they celebrating? I want to know and understand this context and the language and the ways of life and how the gospel speaks into this way of life. And I want to call people into the gospel. And in Faithful Presence, I architect the way the church is in Book of Acts and throughout the New Testament is three circles. And we got to go into the what I call the half circle place to proclaim the gospel, out of which people are called into this great kingdom, which makes possible discipleship and worship. So, so frankly, there's just a different way of looking at context based on those three models. Well, how do we start? I already kind of alluded to this, but franchise, there's a sense of establishing a Methodist church, whereas update, so we just establish it, right? We are here, Methodists are here, all Methodists out there, you have a place to come, let's go. Versus launch, the update church calls it launch. Why? We want to let people know we got a new supermarket they can come to meet Jesus and all their needs. And in terms of mission and incarnation, I want people to think about landing in this place. I have a theory. I talked to district executives about this. My theory is you get 3 leader or leader couples to go live in a place and commit to that place for 10 years to get jobs and get sustainable life, to know their gifts and how to work together to organize the kingdom. 10 years later, you'll have a church. That's my guarantee. Actually, it's inappropriate, but you know what I'm trying to say. That's how I think. That's how I think mission church works. So the horizon, often for franchise churches, were 3 years. We'll give you 3 years to get your people and butts in the seats and be sustainable. Likewise, the update church works on the 3-year model. We're going to give you salaries, etc., health insurance for 3 years. And then in 3 years, man, if you don't have it made, boom, you're out. You're a failure. Sorry. And then, for mission, I want people to think of 10 to 15 years of commitment to a place and engaging this place for the kingdom of God. Wayne Gordon of Lawndale Christian Community, a guy who teaches on campus here at Northern Seminary, a graduate of Northern Seminary, said, if you know anything about Lawndale, it's a church of about 1,000, but it's had a major impact in Lawndale, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city of Chicago for many years. And he says, you know, Dave, if you had been here 15 years into it, you would have said nothing is happening here. But, you know, you go there now, major impact. People come from all over the world to go see what happened in Lawndale Church. So I just want people to have that horizon in terms of church planting, and for that matter, revitalizing churches. 10 to 15 years of beautiful work of cultivating a garden and let God work. For worship, the franchise church, well, it was pretty simple. You just transfer the entire liturgy, Methodist hymn book, and do it in a different place. It's not that. You just need a professionally trained person in the Methodist ways. In the update model, you got to get a good band. You got to translate the music to its contemporary, relevant. You know, you got to update from, frankly, that music you were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, Stan, not going to work anymore. Okay, you got to update music, your jokes. A lot of things need to be updated, but you know, think about how Willow Creek was cutting edge with the way they produced and I do mean produced, worship services or seeker services in those early years. But for mission, I want us to think about worship as part of an established rhythm that does not stand alone. It becomes a place by which we gather ourselves that's part of feeding into and out into our life for the rest of the other 6.5 days of the week and the other circles of our lives. Church is all 3 circles of our lives, I like to say, and I don't have time to explain the 3 circles, but worship is just something that is part, and it makes no sense if the other parts of our rhythms of our everyday lives are not also part of the way of life. I can go on and talk about, let's say, justice. How does justice work in the franchise model? There is no justice in the franchise model. Why? Because the franchise model is part of the established culture, which is already Christian, and we just expect the government to do justice. And, you know, we might have to rally a vote every once in a while to get the Republican in, if you know what I'm saying. But, you know, for the franchise model, justice is just not on the front burner. For the update model, we do projects. We do justice projects. We have a lot of people, a lot of money with about 2 hours a month to volunteer for justice projects. Let's put them to work and get them out there. But you notice the distancing effect of the update model, because it's still operating as a part of established society. For the mission incarnational model of church plant, justice is is part of developing a presence in the neighborhood, a presence where the hurting and the lost are, a regular being there. I call it the third circle. And it takes, the third circle takes various shapes. In Westmont, we have a guy in the zoning committee who goes and sits on the zoning committee twice a month. And I call it opening space for the kingdom and the struggles there for justice. I go hang out at Potbelly Bar where there's a bunch of broken people going through various things, and I feel very at home there. And I go there same time, same place every week. We have people who go minister among homeless shelters or hospitals, or we have a large immigrant community, refugee community on the south side of Westmont, where we have people there who spend regular time there. And out of that, space is open and gospel is proclaimed, and resources make sense to be shared, not as a client church, have not client relationship, but as part of living life among people with the gospel. So all these things change depending on what model of church planting and ways of understanding church plant and church. Questions?
You know, if I'm sitting here,
Stan,
yeah.
you've turned off the chat. You've turned off the chat. We can't type.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
We'd love to give you questions, but when you don't let us participate, it's hard to do that.
Hey, I apologize. The chat is now turned on, so my mistake.
Hey, don't blame us old guys for not knowing how to do the technology.
I'm just making an observation.
I appreciate that, Blaine. Appreciate it. Well, it gives us a little more time to talk about Carlos Santana and Tower of Power. No. Hey, now Tower of Power has a lot of church people in it.
Okay, if you keep doing this, half the people are going to check out real fast.
I know. There is a question though, and I apologize for accidentally turning off the chat. Boy, if I'm in a leadership role for a middle judicatory, a district, that's a culture shift, a mind change. I may be open to it, exploring the idea, but I'm also asking, people to come along beside that. And as you think about it, how do you begin to shift a culture of a church body, a regional body that is supporting and, in a sense, doing the sending as well?
I only have a few comments on this because I feel like this, Stan, might be your job.
Thanks.
I have a few comments. I think we need laboratories. Number one, to reshape imagination for church planting. Two, by the way, I'm part of a denomination that sends missionaries out and does this all the time overseas. But for goodness sakes, what is the problem? Why can't we do the same thing here that we do over there? I'm at my small denomination, half 500,000 people in the United States. It's been 500,000 people for 30 years. Overseas, we started with, 1,000 missionaries, and there's 3.5 million of us overseas. What does that tell you?
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, my point is we need laboratories. The second thing we need to realize is that this way of church planting is very, relatively speaking, inexpensive. It helps people get located, finds a housing stipend and some health insurance for 3 years while they get a job. They need coaching on how to get a job. And then they need the coaching on how to think about a job and how to think about how that integrates in ministry and location. But it's much less expensive than paying $500,000 for superstar celebrity to start a new church with sis boom bah, speakers, smoke machines, blah, blah, blah. The last thing I'll say is we need to realize that millennials, and to some extent slightly older than millennials, and then the generation beneath millennials, are just completely burnt out on planting update churches. Matter of fact, they have burnt out from going to update churches. And there's just a lot of people like this ready for a new expression of church. And are the denominations going to respond? That's my pitch.
And guess what? We now have some questions coming in. Okay, so Blaine asks, in a church who asks for revitalization but is reluctant to accept the changes needed to grow, the missional context seems to be threatening to churches which are slowly dying. If you like to, how would you comment to that statement?
I'm not sure I understand it entirely, but let's just put it this way. The mission incarnational way of church is threatening to churches that are slowly dying. Is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
And I would say, of course. And I would say, don't try this on your mother-in-law. You know what I mean? All right, so let me put it another way. My mom is 91 years old. She lives in Florida about 15 minutes from the Christian Missionary Alliance. That's my denomination's retirement system. And they have a village church in the middle of this retirement system. And all the old CMA people go to church on Sunday. And if you walk in, it reminds me of when I went to church in 1965 as a little boy. And I'm having these unbelievable feelings. Oh, it's so good. So nostalgic. I'm feeling and I'm going, this is great. This is fantastic. It reminds me of Delta Tabernacle Church, 1965. I am not going to take this away from Mom. But unfortunately, this church, everybody in this church is over the age of 72. And this church probably has a lifespan of another 10, 15 years. I'm not going to take this away from my mom. I'm not going to try to change my mom. I'm going to find 12 people in my church. And if they're not in my church, I'm going to go walk up and down the streets like Jesus did, up and down the shores of Galilee, and find 12 people. And I'm going to start by having a meal with them and start tending to what God's doing in our lives, proclaiming gospel among ourselves, praying for the neighborhood. I'm going to start with 12. If you got a church of 1,000, start with 12 people. If you got a church of 100, start with 12 people. If you got 2 people left in your church, go find 12 people and begin the revolution there in that way with revitalizing your church. This is what I have seen as really the only way. You can't turn around a big ship very quickly, but you can disrupt it and start something new by working with a small group. And by the way, it's so encouraging, life-giving to you and me as pastors to be with 12 people and see God work and see God break through and do great things in people's lives, and then train them how to be in these places of brokenness to see God work in your neighborhood.
That flows so well into the next question. Leah is asking, how can we help local residents and established church members learn to exegete their long-term context? Any resources? Are there any resources, she asked, for training lay people to think more missionally?
Yeah, well, okay. I can give you a few books. I'll just tell you what I do. I have one sheet of paper. I wish I had it with me right now, where I use Luke chapter 10, the story of Jesus sending the disciples out. And I say, here are the things we want to pay attention to. And there's like 8 or 9 P's. I'll just give a few of them. And by the way, tell you what, Stan, if you email me, I will send you this document, and you can post it wherever you are going to post it, and hopefully it'll help somebody. But pennies. Try to understand the flow of money in your village or your neighborhood. Who has the money? Who doesn't? Money is power. Money is coercive power. And then how can we go inhabit and proclaim the gospel to those who don't have money and among those who do? Pain. Look for the places of pain and hurt, and where people are just dealing with the bruises and the victimizations of their lives and what's been done to them, and go live there long enough to know and understand the abuse. So much is being covered over, and proclaim the healing of the gospel, the forgiveness, the reconciliation, the presence of God to sustain us and heal us. I have, hold on with me now. Party. Go discern where people are experiencing celebration and figure out what they're celebrating and why, and participate in that celebration and give glory to God in that celebration. Privilege. Go into a village or town and try to see the work where privilege is at work in oppressing people, so that you can proclaim the gospel of good news to those who are underneath that privilege, that they too are called of God to live in kingdom. So there are all these ways to go into a particular town and village and train people to look for things. So at our seminary, I'll go through these things, and I'll use a book by Gerald Arbuckle. I can't remember the name of it now, but it's really good missionary book about how to look for things in culture and how to then proclaim the gospel. And we'll then go out into a place, and we'll just start to observe things and train people to get out of the church. Okay, go sit in that restaurant, listen for conversations, take notice of people and their faces and the hurt and the pain, and then be there long enough to maybe get into a conversation. And I just think that this is maybe the first step towards inhabiting a half circle. And I believe unless Christians inhabit a third space, like mine is Potbelly Bar on Cass Avenue, Wednesday nights. I believe if you're not inhabiting a place where the people are who are hurting and painful. I could tell the story of how I found Potbelly Bar and why I chose Potbelly Bar, why I felt the Holy Spirit was leading me to Potbelly Bar. But all those things come into it. And my life is transformed by being involved in the lives of people who are seeking God. They don't always know it's God, but me sitting there listening, I'll go, oh man, when you said that sounded like God for this reason and this reason and this reason. And it just enhances, I think, our own Christian lives. It challenges us when we see God working in people afresh and anew. And I think this is how we are to lead people into their respective contexts.
Yeah. I'm also familiar with another author. I think his name is Benar, Benar. I think he writes out of the Nazarene Church, and he's written a couple books as well on exegeting your community. And so those are some other resources.
I I have a syllabus. I have a bibliography somewhere. Arbuckle's book is the first one that came to mind, but there are
Yeah.
numerous resources for this kind of thing. Yeah.
And Samuel's asking, what about church planting in the digital age? That it gets into a millennial. And then with that, Crystal's asking, does a church plant have to be in a stationed place, a building, she means. So those two questions, church planting in a digital age, and does a church plant have to be in a particular building?
Yeah, I mean, so these are challenging questions. I'll just speak out of my own experience. I feel, frankly, too often. So I'm in a church plant that's totally bought into the incarnational, missional church way of doing things. But sometimes I believe they overreact. So they shun Twitter, Facebook, shun, internet. We do have a website, but I think I had to push them a little bit for that, my fellow pastors. I think we can. I think we should. It's the way. It's the highway. It's the ways people talk and live. I think we should use it, but we should discerningly use it. Too often we attract people that are just like us, and I believe that's not the kingdom. Second thing is, I don't believe that church can impact the world without what I call a political presence. By political, I do not mean national politics or voting or Republican, Democrat. I mean a presence in a community that is active and engaged in face-to-face social reality that gives that witnesses to how we live together. That's a politic. So I believe we need a real presence. Real presence is a sacramental word. I believe we need a sacramental, real social presence in a community to disrupt the powers and be present for the gospel. Does that always mean having a building? No. No, not at all. But it does not necessarily mean never. Sometimes a building can function quite well. Like in our case, we really need a building right now because we're running more and more into people without homes that have a hard time finding a halfway back into wholeness and being able to get situated to afford and be in their own apartment or house or whatever. And we wish we had a building with 2 or 3 places where people could stay, because folks, this is where the harvest shall become. This is where it is, amongst the hurting and the broken, not amongst the rich and who, nothing against money, but the people who have made, who the last time they thought about God was for an hour on Sunday morning. No, we need to be among the poor, the hurting, the broken, the oppressed. This is where God will do his work, his revolution, and probably drag all the rich people in with him. So I just think a building can be helpful sometimes, so we shouldn't write it off.
I'm going to just make a comment here. And David, is there anything else that you'd like to say? We have a couple minutes left, and any other final thoughts or closing thoughts? Also, anyone else with a question or comment that they would like to make?
Well, I just want to say that, I want to validate different ways of church planting and the discernment of your context and how that plays into the kind of church planting God's called you to do. Likewise, for those who are revitalizing churches, all these things come into play. And I don't want to idealize, and I feel like I've fallen into that trap sometimes, of mission incarnational church planting. But somebody, I'll just close with this. Somebody once asked me, Martin Robinson from the UK asked me, "Oh, this is so much hard work, Dave. you're planting all these churches, and we're not planting all these churches. We planted 4 in total, Life on the Vine, that is. And he said, oh, that's a lot of hard work. I go, hard work? It's just Christian life. It's just living the Christian life and doing it with 2 or 3 other leaders. And it's so life-giving. I'll tell you what's hard work is trying to do an update church plant model and keeping 1,000 people happy all at the same time. That's hard work. So I just want to open up space to rethink church planting and how it can be a powerful expression of the gospel, and God can do great things through the Brethren Church.
Thank you, David, for sharing this hour with us. It's been terrific, and all the insights, and for responding to questions. And I apologize to everyone for accidentally shutting off the chat box so that you're unable to respond. And thanks, Blaine, for bringing that to attention. I have posted the CEU link in the chat box for you. Click on the link, take it. It'll take you to the site, fill it out, and we will have that processed as soon as possible. And that comes to you by way of Brethren Academy. The other thing is, I'd just like to say, this is a beginning conversation with David. We're looking to have some additional conversations into 2019, and in terms of helping us to fill out, get a better feel for what we're talking about here in terms of this missional church plan and what this means in terms of leadership. How do we need to think about it as we're discerning church planting, church revitalization, and what this means for the community of faith, where our Church of the Brethren congregations are in relationship to their context. And David, we wish you well and God's richest blessings in your ministry, Life on the Vine, and as you're teaching, leading, guiding, and mentoring students and those who are looking to be servants of Christ. So,
thanks very much, Stan. Thanks to everybody else. It's been great to be with you, and I look forward to hearing more. God bless.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again, and thanks for being with us today. Blessings and peace to you. Bye-bye.